Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing another Sharks player review. And today we have Sharks goaltender Adin Hill. Now, Hill doesn't really have a lot of history with the San Jose Sharks. In fact, picking up Adin Hill was one of Doug Wilson's final moves that he made as San Jose Sharks general manager. It would only be a few months later where he would sort of step aside for medical reasons and eventually step down as Sharks general manager, and Joe Will would step in as the interim. And I feel as though there are very easy comparisons to draw between the pickup of Adin Hill to the pickup of Martin Jones just 6 years earlier. Clearly, Doug Wilson was aiming to pick up to end up in a very, very similar situation as that. You see, back in the 2015 offseason, the Sharks were coming off of their first season having missed the playoffs in a very long while, but it was kind of planned in a way to miss the playoffs. After the 2014 season where the Sharks were reverse swept by the Los Angeles Kings, Wilson made it clear that the Sharks were looking to take one step back to take two steps forward, and so they missed in 2015. They managed to draft Timo Meier. They signed players like Joel Ward and Paul Martin, who were very, very important for the Sharks franchise over the next couple of seasons, and most importantly, they picked up a new starting goaltender, and that was Martin Jones, who was backup for the Los Angeles Kings at that time. He was very inexperienced. He only had about 30 games under his belt, and his stats, while impressive, were definitely inflated by the fact that he played behind a very strong Los Angeles Kings team. But in the end, the trade ended up working out marvelously for the San Jose Sharks. He played quite solid for them in the regular season, and in particular led them to their first ever Stanley Cup Finals appearance that season by playing some absolutely outstanding hockey, and was in fact, at least in that final series against the Pittsburgh Penguins, he was their MVP, even though the Sharks did lose that one in 6 games. So 6 years later, the Sharks were looking to emulate that very same situation by trading for Adin Hill. Similar to Martin Jones, he only had about 40 games under his belt when he was picked up as backup, or sort of backup, with the Arizona Coyotes. His stats were unimpressive, but they were kind of, in a way, the opposite of Martin Jones, where they're deflated because he was playing with a pretty bad Arizona Coyotes team. And so they picked him up from Arizona in exchange for Koshinash as well as a second-round pick. However, there were still sort of a bit of a hedging bets situation for the San Jose Sharks, as they also made sure to sign James Reimer this past offseason to be that kind of guy who could fill in for Adin Hill if things did go poorly. Now, Adin Hill actually had an okay start to the season. In fact, his preseason was sort of hopeful heading into the regular season, and he helped lead the San Jose Sharks to that 4-0 start that seems like so long ago that they had at the beginning of the 21-22 season. He won 3 of those 4 games, but from those 3 games, it all kind of just went downhill after that, and the major problem with Adin Hill throughout this entire season was his lack of consistency. He could go from one game getting a shutout or just letting in a single goal and having like a 30 to 35 save performance, and then just 2 days later in a different game, even against a worse team, he would come up and let in, let's say, 3 or 4 low danger opportunities and just end up giving up like 5 goals in total. It was just, you just couldn't really depend on him to give you a half decent performance even every single night. It was just up here and then it was all the way down here. And compared to James Reimer, who when he played was very, very consistent, Adin Hill definitely left a lot to be desired. And so about halfway through the season, or even before that, Adin Hill had pretty clearly lost the starting goaltending job to James Reimer. He was still getting a few games here or there, but as you can see, he only ended up playing 22 or starting 22 games. Now, on top of that, of course, Adin Hill would end up getting injured at the end of January, and ironically enough, he'd only play a single game in March, which would be a shutout against the Los Angeles Kings, but otherwise he would pretty much miss the final 3 months of the season. So that is also a big reasoning why he only ended up starting 22 games. He probably would have ended the season around 30 to 35 if not for that injury. But I think the major point here that we could say is that the Sharks seem to have wavered in their hope for Adin Hill. And the reason I say that is because at the trade deadline of this past season, the San Jose Sharks actually made a move where they moved Jacob Middleton, which was not a surprise, but it was a surprise that they brought back a goaltender from the Minnesota Wild. That was Kaapo Kähkönen. You see, at the time of the trade deadline, it was pretty clear to everybody that the Sharks were not going to make the playoffs that season. And so there was definitely not a need to fill in a backup goaltending role. The Sharks have very, very easily could have just ran with James Reimer as the starter and Zach Sawchenko as the Sharks' backup. But instead, they decided to go for Kaapo Kähkönen, another goaltender, and I imagine since they make a move like this that they would be willing to re-sign him at the end of this season since he is a restricted free agent, which means unless they were to move James Reimer, they're heading into next season with 3 goaltenders on the roster, and both Kaapo Kähkönen and Adin Hill are young enough to potentially be starters for the future for the San Jose Sharks. So this season, it was clearly not really a competition, and it was more so just a season to try and groom Adin Hill into being a starting goaltender. But going into the next season, it seems as though there's trying to incite some competition between those 2 goaltenders, though I guess we will have to see if indeed the Sharks do re-sign Kähkönen. Further into Hill's stats here, like I mentioned already, the 22 games started, 10 wins, so he almost won half of his games. His stats, honestly, were not all that bad. 2.66 GAA and a .906 save percentage. These are quite average when you consider the fact that the scoring league-wide was way up this past season. So like I said, Hill would have games where he was all the way up here, and he'd have games where he was all the way down there, and it would average out to be pretty decent performance, I would say. But compared to 6 years ago when Martin Jones stepped in as the starter for the San Jose Sharks, did a very, very strong job, led them to the playoffs, led them to the Stanley Cup Finals, I could definitely say that Doug Wilson, or I guess by extension now Joe Will, is relatively disappointed with the performance that Adin Hill did put up here this season. They were likely hoping for just that bit more, but honestly, it just kind of goes to show that the Sharks picking up an inexperienced backup goaltender, they kind of lucked out with how well Martin Jones did those 6 years ago, and the performance of Adin Hill this season is kind of more of what is to be expected when you make a move like this. So in terms of grading, sort of at a baseline here, when you consider all of those circumstances, Hill honestly didn't have that terrible of a season. It obviously wasn't all that great. He didn't get the starting job, which is why Reimer ended up with the grade of an A or an A-, and Adin Hill is significantly below that, but it was still an above average season for him, and he ends up with the grade of a C+. Class dismissed.